Hello everyone, this is Join the Light Side TV with your host, Michael. So today I'm going to be delving into a topic which I had promised in my last video, which is sort of trying to answer the question, what is Marxism? Now, in addressing this question, we also can't help but make some slight deviations into what is communism, what is socialism, and what is Gnosticism. I'm going to try my best to keep on point on describing what Marxism is, but there is some parts where I'm not going to be able to avoid those little side avenues, because if I were to attempt that, then, well, I would be missing the point entirely. All right, so let's get started. So according to Marx himself, he actually, if only it would take this short of time, he actually responded with answering the question what Marxism is in one sentence, which he summarizes as communism, which is actually the end goal of his structuring of society. Communism can be summarized in one single sentence: the abolition of private property. So, in saying that, that is a part of the sort of makeup for what communism is. And later in the episode, we'll be addressing more of what communism is. But right now, we're going to be keeping with Marxism. So, it's really interesting to note that before we kick things off further, the original title to the Communist Manifesto was actually supposed to be the Communist Confession of Faith. And under the advisement of Friedrich Engels, the co-author of the Communist Manifesto, he recommended actually that they switch the title to the Communist Manifesto. They were largely actually trying to propose that what they were proposing, Marxism, is a social economic theory. And the thing is that it also a scientific theory. The thing is that it is none of those things. Actually, it is more in line with a religion more than anything. And I believe that in order to basically deflate this unholy monster, I'm not a religious man myself, but the actual faith of Marxism itself, and I could also say the same of communism, is in fact like a religion. So, moving on now, so this is sort of the layout for what Marxism is. It's more of a worldview than a science, which Marx himself, he coined the phrase Wissenschaftler Sozialismus, which means in German scientific socialism. And he believed that, in essence, society was categorized into two groups, which you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Now, the bourgeoisie was the rich ruling class, which he believed basically controlled and structured society, and in that it recreates itself. So then it basically creates the cycle of oppression and oppressor, and it basically necessitates and creates itself. And and in that, basically it just creates this vicious cycle and it never goes away. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat that it is a oversimplified dichotomy. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't sort of a loosely laid like foundational layer, which like it's somewhat congruent to reality, this proposition that there is a very small subset, which is also known as the Pareto distribution, where there's a very small subset of people which they possess a lofty amount of resources and they have a ton of them at their disposal. Now, where I reject where Marx goes with it is that he like already lays the assumption, and in that it is confirmatory, where it just looks for evidence to prove itself right, that it is structured this way throughout society. So basically, if you're rich or if you're like middle class and upward, that you're like a violent oppressor, basically, which I just don't think that is actually true. Also in that, so I guess this would actually be useful to somewhat explain as to why Marxism is actually thought of as a religion. And I think that if this argument was taken as seriously as it should, then this would actually largely destroy the sort of movement that is attempted to take hold in the Western world right now, where, like, for example, in the United States, there's actually a constitutional right which it can forfeit any sort of religious system from taking place within places of education and in the government. So if it were to actually take this proposition seriously, then it would lose a lot of its revolutionary momentum. And okay, so I sort of explained why we should reject it, and then here is the why. Okay, so it's a religion in itself, as the cultural critic James Lindsay explains. There is roughly speaking, a duty of conscience, which fleshed out more. It's the feelings of what we ought to do, morally speaking. It has a theory of the creation of man. So it has a form of Genesis myth. It has a vision of the end times, which is the utopia, because before I continue even more, hopefully I won't be doing that too much in this video, there is sort of a progression as to how Marxism, socialism, and communism all are actually intrinsically linked together. So Marxism in itself tries to actually bring about a socialist-based system, which it basically tries to allocate all the power into the state. And there's actually a series of principles as to what it seeks to do in order to make this happen. In a very startling sense, we can actually see some of this take hold in the sort of electoral system and the policies that are taking place within the West right now. So here are some of the principles that are necessary with a socialist-based state, which pushes for equity, not equality, equity. So there is the call for a centralized system for monetary control. So basically there's the centralization of the banking system, that all of it is controlled by the government or by the state. There's the absolute takeover of media outlets, or at least the main ones. So basically they are the controllers of propaganda. There is a public-private partnership enterprise, which is, in other words, it's a fascist-based enterprise. And I think that's actually a term that is much too loosely used these days, fascist, when I'm pretty sure that for the most part, not a lot of people actually know that's actually what the term fascist means, that form of collusion. There's a heavy progressive tax, and we actually already have this taxing system in Canada, that the more you earn, the more harshly that you're taxed. And I, being a sort of classically liberal / libertarian, more sensibly oriented person, and more as of late conservative, this sort of proposition I don't think actually helps like anybody really. I think that this one really needs to be repealed in a lot of ways. I think that there is a level of fairness that does come with sort of like businesses, where if they make like a ridiculous sum of money, then some of that should be going back into the communities that that they're using for their consumer base, especially with like public maintenance, with like road work and everything, because there's a good chance that they're actually using those same roads for their production purposes. So I think there is certainly a reasonable realm for us to talk about that with, but certainly to the extent of which this is being taken in Canada, it is gone way too far, and now basically everything is being taxed to hell. We have a carbon tax system, which is absolutely egregious, especially on the coast of Canada. We're now facing, under a metric system, $2 a liter for gas, or it's like on the brink of turning into that. And I think that these petroleum gas companies, they're trying their best not to teeter into that zone, because it is a very scary number that nobody wants to see, but I think that they are going to teeter into that. So getting back on point, there's also the possibility of property rights confiscation. That would come with the intention that they're trying to abolish private property rights, at least to the everyday person. I don't think that the same rule would be applied to these huge corporate entities, or above that, the sort of hedge fund managers and whatnot that actually lend these assets in order for them to get these short-term payouts that these corporate companies need for their short-term solutions in terms of like materials that they need to produce goods to issue to the consumer. So basically, hedge fund entities that operate under the ESG system. So moving forward, there's also government ownership of transport and communication, which one of those communication arms could actually be the media. That's already being implemented in Canada. And also the transport system is, it's complicated. It's not directly owned by the government, but it's heavily like regulated by the government, to the point where you can almost say that like there's so much cooperation where it is basically a governmental arm, as far as I can tell. So this is more of the, as it's termed, vulgar Marxist interpretation of like Marxism, where it's like, there's a capturing of agricultural and factory production. So anything that produces food and like metals or things like that, that would be government owned. And there's also eventually there would be a form of control where in this like fully realized socialist system, which is to say like with Marxism, that there would be a prescription of your occupation. So it would be the Brave New World sort of proposition, where like basically as soon as you're of working age, they prescribe you a job. Like you don't get a choice. And it'd be like, look how admirable it is for you to be doing what you're doing. Wow, it is so great to be you, and that sort of thing. So that is the layout for what needs to exist for like a Marxist system to be fully realized in that sense. So there's that. And then going back to what I was saying with the whole reason as to why Marxism is a religion, just a quick summarization of what I was talking about before, because it was just a few minutes ago. There is a duty of conscience, which is the feelings of what we ought to do, morally speaking. It has a theory of the creation of man, so a form of Genesis myth. There's a vision of the end times, which is actually more toward the absolute implementation of socialism, where it would say that the goal of socialism is the absolute control of the state, and then basically after gains full control, and it creates the sort of perfect equitable conditions that the state would wither away, and then the utopia would basically just like appear. And that this is in itself a alchemic principle where basically the gold is contained within the lead. All you have to do is basically chip away at it, and it's contained within. So there's that. And Marxism, like I said before, it is a worldview. Like everything that transpires, you can see through a deeply cynical and criticizing lens. It has an explanation for everything. It is very confirmatory. It has absolutely no falsifiable pretense. So it is very far from a science. And actually, Karl Popper, in I believe it was the 60s, he actually offered this sort of proposition as to why we really shouldn't be taking Marxism seriously. And it also provides a spiritual meaning to its followers, or a form of purpose, or said otherwise, a telos. And that is through praxis, which is merging theory and practice. You can't just like read about Marxism and have it be acceptable in the zealot's point of view. You have to also act upon it in order for it to be good. There's also needs to be attention put towards the people that influence Marx. So Hegel was certainly one of the most profound influences on Marx, but he largely, as far as I can tell, the sort of principle that he had, which was the most profound of influence from Hegel, sort of how he thought of the Holy Trinity. So Hegel put up that like there was like the absolute knowledge or form of gnosis, which like informed our sort of knowledge base with the world. Now, Marx took that and he basically flipped it on its head. Instead of the absolute being in form of the God, which is like above us, it's not us. Basically, Marx believed man to be God, which I think is a very dangerous proposition. And when it merged with this, the empowerment of the oppressed mindset of which he frames, it basically created a dangerous precedent for this sort of, religious fervor for anybody who could be deemed as an oppressor. It basically created this absolutely justifiable cause. As for like, I would say that you could actually see this in the summer, I think it was of 2020 and 2021, with the BLM riots, where it swept through the nation, and these businesses that had absolutely like nothing to do with what happened with George Floyd, they were swallowed up in the absolute revolutionary energy which was captured in this whole thing. And like billions and billions of dollars of these people who were not involved in any way, shape, or form were just burned to the ground, looted, like absolutely terrible things which happened. So there's that. So there was Hegel for an influence, and then there was Goethe. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. He wrote the story, which actually have it on my shelf behind me, and I am blanking as to what the title is. It is Faust. That is what I was getting at. The story Faust, and one of the characters which profoundly influenced Marx. And there will be another time where I talk about the history behind Marx. His favorite character was Mephistopheles, which is the mouth of the devil. His favorite quote from him, as paraphrased by some people, and basically in summarization was everything that exists deserves to perish. Yeah, awfully charming, right? Now here is the full quote so you can impress your friends. I am this spirit that negates, and rightly so, for all that comes to be deserves to perish wretchedly. 'Twere better nothing would begin. Thus everything that your terms, sin, destruction, evil represent, that is my proper element. Yeah, not really a hell of a lot better. Yeah, so that was one of his influences. There's also Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and I think that these people influenced Marx in as so much as he was basically an opposition to these figures, which were basically laying the foundational layers for a free market, like capitalist society. And also to take note that the term capitalist and capitalism is actually a Marxist term in itself. Before that time, basically, there was no existence of that sort of term. So it's important to take note of that. There's also Ludwig Feuerbach, which he was a young Hegelian, and Aristotle also greatly influenced Marx as well. And there is more, but for the sake of brevity, we're just going to keep it to that short list. I will provide a description where you can sort of find more detail about this if you'd like. You can do some of your own homework. Something else that is worthy of mention is that there is an unfolding of history which Marx believed that would happen with basically developed societies. So in that, there was the first stage is termed. Okay, so there are 5 stages in total, and this is what is called historical materialism according to philosophers. So stage 1 is primitive communism, and this is verbatim. This is me reading this from an outside source. Primitive communism is outlined as a primitive society, no ownership of anything, at least made explicitly. They are nomadic and collective societies that are naturally egalitarian. So basically, as like humans first existed, this is how he believed that how humans were, basically as a blank slate sort of concept, which in itself I think is a pretty ridiculous notion to be referring to, but I digress. No, number 2 in these stages is the slave society. So that would be agriculture begins to flourish and the production begins commodification. So a ruling class forms and oppresses the working class. So this is the development of sort of like the early stages of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And then comes the 3rd stage of feudalism, which is the eventual decline of slavery. The feudal lords who own land now offer protection to the working people who work for them in exchange for meager restitution for protection. This right was based on mutual obligations and rights. So basically, it would be sort of a pointing out that, like, while I own the land, in order for us to thrive, there has to be people working the farmlands and accumulating that form of production, and then we give it to the feudal lords, and then they basically, we give you a form of compensation for that, as Marx termed that was capital, and because they had control over the lands, and if you weren't to follow the sort of ruling that was in place, they basically just destroy and pillage you, which there actually is something to that. I think that actually was largely a reality back then. And then in the 4th stage, there is capitalism, which he believed that, not explicitly, if you were to follow these stages, that's like what we're currently in. Marx theorized that capitalism will be the strongest point in history that will eventually lead to collapse. The means of production are owned privately, and the working class, or the proletariat, sells their labor to the capitalist class, which is the bourgeoisie, in exchange for capital, or wages. Marx posited that capitalism is riddled with contradictions and class struggle, to which he's not totally wrong on that, but the sorts of solutions in which he offers for that, I think, are utterly absurd, and that's actually the next stage of which is proposed, which is the final stage, stage number 5, socialism and communism. So socialism is the transitional step into communism. Socialism is the beginning of abolishing private property and the redistribution of wealth, and at the end of history, which is the sort of religiosity aspect which is being implemented, at the end of history, the party apparatus has gained full control. It will end all contradictions and solve them all. There would be a form of reconciliation with that. The state will wither away at its own accord because it's no longer necessary, and at which the utopia will be realized on Earth. So it basically takes the sort of idea that that the utopia is, in fact, heaven, like on Earth, which I think is a very startling prospect. Which it's, if you were to look in the way of which they like talk about utopianism, there's actually like they actively are against trying to prescribe any real description of what it is, because if you were to provide a vision for that, then it would be immediately conservative. That's actually how the critical theorists think on this front. And another form of note, under socialism, they gain complete control over production and the decentralization of wealth, which we actually see is like being attempted right now with the sort of playing at that they're trying to create these central banks, and it's there's a great deal of lying going about that. I know that I actually saw a video with the Canadian government trying to propose centralized banks in Canada, and that it would offer a form of safeguard and stability to the economy, which if you actually see what the government has done with the money over the last few years and just been printing it off and completely destroying our economic power, I would not trust them with any more that we already have and what they already have. I don't think we have very much reason to trust them to begin with. So I don't know about you, but that sounds like a really profoundly terrible idea. I think it's also important to note too that with the sorts of talks around the centralizing currency, Marx also indicated that he thinks that it is necessary to basically break the chain of lineage where you can't have intergenerational wealth, that after you die, basically all the money gets absorbed by the state. And in that, it didn't just stop there. He actually called for the breaking of the family unit because there's the possibility of a form of conservatism and a conserving of traditional values, which forms and creates a bridge between the parental and like children's generation to create, well, a likeness and a sameness. And that can't happen if there's a paternal government in place, because then you actually have reason to not fall like in line with the governmental apparatus, because maybe your parents don't think as progressively, quote, as the government does. So there's also that to consider. And it is also interesting to see the congruence that comes in with the radicalization of the generation that is being brought up with the digital age, and how there seems to be a small demographic of kids that are basically outing their parents in the same way that the Red Guard did in China, that basically that their parents are hopelessly lost and that they're basically irredeemable bigots, and it's there's very little sort of charitable recollections of each other's arguments and sort of what's going on there, which I think is a great tragedy in itself. So that's sort of the summarization of what's going on with Marxism here, and just to recapture some of the themes behind what we're just discussing here. Marxism is more in line with a religion than it is that of a social and economic theory. It is extremely confirmatory. It doesn't actually hold up to like any scrutiny whatsoever, and you'll actually notice that people that are like deeply socialist and deeply communist, like you can actually have like a genuine conversation with a lot of these people that I would term as zealots, that basically they have an emotional reaction that you're sort of like questioning their worldview and whether if it's actually best to be implementing. And there seems to actually be a failure to recognize how humans actually operate and sort of the things that motivate us to like be a contributing member of society. And the way that it doesn't happen in the way that that it's proposed with communism and socialism. And sort of to recap, there is distinctiveness between socialism and capitalism, in that with the implementation of socialism, unfortunately, there can be reasonable implementations as to how it can be sustainable for a population in terms of like, I mean, there are a lot of people have differences in opinion with this sort of sentiment, but in my view, socialized healthcare does have a place, especially if you have like a minor injury, such as like your kid is outside and they're playing with the neighbors and they break an arm. Now, if you're in the United States, like, don't quote me on this, but I believe that it is a few $1,000s to have your arm looked at, and it like that sort of hospital visit for sort of like a rite of passage, like growing up and getting to know the world and sort of making some reasonable mistakes that way. I don't think we should be punished that harshly for these sorts of things. So I think that to an extent, socialized healthcare is perfectly reasonable to be trying to implement, and for everybody to be able to have access to fair healthcare, and that really, like within the developed world in which we should be able to mitigate a lot of this like needless suffering, especially if we tread carefully with like sort of the taxation measure. Like, I think that is something fair that we can certainly have a discussion about and making happen. But the thing is that as termed with equality of outcome, which is equity, if you're to actually put that into action and put it across the board as a universal standard, it's actually like a pretty known fact within economics that equity equalizes downward, that it actually squashes innovation like heavily. And if you don't actually have an incentive structure which allows people to be benefited for having innovative ideas, completely disincentivizes people, and it basically wants people to like eventually live on a within a welfare state, which is heavily paternalized. And it's like, well, what's the point of me working harder if there's no incentive, which is I think actually sort of one of the greatest hubris of this whole idea of socialism and communism. It's like one of those things that there's many things about it in theory. They sound like they could be quite attractive, and that's sort of the seductive pull that it brings in, is like, well, what if we could all just like be equal in that respect and sort of like just get along and sing kumbaya in that way. But unfortunately, that's there's a great measure of just like, that's not actually how like humans thrive, that we need like a greater goal to be striving for here. And a lot of the time that does need to be personalized, that we need a personal goal in mind rather than sacrificing on the altar sort of these things that we really shouldn't be having to give up too much, where everything is like sacrificed on the altar towards like sustainability. There's like things about the argument which are like can be reasonable, but for this sort of agenda that's being laid out by the like Liberal Party of Canada, for instance, they want to, by 2030, for every citizen to be on an electric vehicle. And that is like completely unrealistic. We don't have the infrastructure to support that. And not to mention, like, our economy is completely shot. Like, people can barely afford like just basic living, like in general. Like, if you were to look across Canada with inflation occurring, like, people are just struggling just to make basic ends meet. And now you want them to purchase like a over $50,000 vehicle for one, and then be able to have a power station set up. And basically, there's a lot of like needing to like, well, at least from what's been happening, is there's been a lot of invention of money, but no actual production, and like what like would provide the wind behind a lot of these initiatives. So unfortunately, it's not grounded in reality at all. Like, there is certainly room for wanting to provide a grander vision for the greater flourishment of humanity, but the thing is that this is from a very Rousseauian standpoint, the sort of social contract that we have to give up some of our freedoms in order to have like a form of social cohesion. And it's reasonable in that proposition for us to like, you know, not do things like steal and murder and things like that. That is obviously within reason, but there is these sorts of things are being now put out that it is not a conspiracy theory. There's talks within Europe that they're wanting to generate these 15-minute cities that basically you can't like go anywhere, like they won't allow you to. And while these things haven't been implemented yet, they're certainly putting them on the table, and they're wanting to make them happen in a very totalitarian way. And it's just, these things are what we really need to be mindful of, and that there's a lot of deception going on with it, and that we should be treating these things as if they are a real possibility. Because the sorts of tales and the sorts of warnings that are provided for like George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, that were basically like sending out a warning that in the very near future that these sorts of things, they're very well possible. So yeah, that is that concludes this episode for now. And I will be providing a series of links in the description below. And if you liked today's episode, or if you didn't like today's episode, please let me know. Like, if there is a form of information that you have some form of contention with, or there's a form of inaccuracy, I would love to generate dialogue around this topic and exercise our right to free speech, because that is one of the greatest things about our countries in the West here. And I think that this is exactly how we have the battleground of ideas, and only the good ones like win out. So yeah, thank you for listening, and please consider giving this video a like, sharing with your family and friends, and subscribing to the channel. I hope to see you again here in my next video. Thank you very much. Have a great day.